Okay, and welcome back. So, if you remember, when we finished talking about French realism, we were talking about this group, the Bâtonneuses group. This was Manet's personal group of hanger-ons, his entourage, his groupies, if you want to call it that. They were a collection of largely middle-class, bourgeois, trust fund kids, flaneurs, guys who had the money and the opportunity to paint whatever they wanted to paint. They had already come through the Salon des Refusés. The Salon des Refusés was a huge scandal and an enormous sensation. And Manet had spent most of his time as a realist sticking his thumb in the eye of the Academy, critiquing their sense of what was acceptable in art, both in terms of subject matter, by making these outrageous scenes that were clearly contemporary nudes, and also in style, by flouting all of the conventions of academic illusionism and painting these flat paintings that had just really clearly, broad brushstrokes, faces that were reduced to just a few smudges. And you can see this in his work. And so a group of people, gathered around Manet, hung around him in his, studio, and went and just chatted at the cafe. And they sat and plotted about what they were going to do next, how we're going to advance art. And their first move was to get another Salon des Refusés. They kept applying to the annual Paris Salon. They kept sending in their works of art, and of course their works of art were rejected as before. And they kept saying, well, you gave us a salon for the rejects, before, let's do it again. Because they realized this gave them an enormous amount of publicity, caused a huge sensation. But the Academy and the Emperor had learned their lesson, and said, heck no, not just no, but heck no, and we're not doing that again. The last thing you want to do is give people a sense that there's some choice other than the official choice. Because the second you do that, people might actually choose the thing you don't want them to choose. And so the ability to control information was their biggest asset. But the mold had been broken. So many people had seen the kind of work that Manet and others were doing in the Salon des Refusés, and there were so many people who were in the middle class who wanted to see something newer and fresher. One of the critiques I think we can make of Marx is that Marx saw the world fundamentally in terms of class, and I agree that's correct. The world is really ruled by class. We can even see it today. But class is far more dynamic than he ever gave it credit for. He assumed that there were rich people at the top and poor people at the bottom, and that's where the tension lied. That's where the tension was, and the tension was between the poor class who had no opportunities, and they would revolt against the richer classes. But the truth is there's just as much tension in the upper classes amongst themselves. You have the nouveau riche who don't have title, but they very much are striving, ambitious, and earnest, and want to get up into those upper echelons, but those upper echelons don't want them there. And it's funny that you see this reversal in class politics. Many of the great academic painters of the 19th century were commoners. They were people who came from the lowest of the low, but they had worked their way up the meritocracy in the academy, and so now they were hanging out with the elites, and they would not have been hanging out with the elites had they not been these great academic painters. So you had people of common position defending the status quo and defending the academy. But then you had all these flaneurs, these rich, trust fund bohemians who didn't have to work for a living, and they were wealthy enough that they could experiment, and it didn't matter. They didn't have to make a living off of their paintings. They could actually just experiment, and that was Manet and his crowd. And so what's interesting is a lot of the social friction in classes actually isn't between the poor and the rich, it's between the middle class and everybody else. because the middle class are very much aware of their tenuous position. They realize that should their fortunes change, they could be shoved down to the poor class because they might have an ancestor or two, they might just only be a generation removed from poverty themselves. And they also have aspirations. They want to be the new elite. Everybody wants to be rich. You can see this in our Instagrams and everything else. We have these aspirations to be the elites. At the same time, we condemn the elites. We're so conflicted as a society. And they were no different. That's why they wanted to get into the Paris Salon. They wanted to turn over the apple carts, but you can't turn over apple carts if they don't let you in, and they weren't about to let them in. So the social friction was actually coming from the middle class, and this was this group of people who were willing to experiment, with style, technique, with contemporary subject matter, and really were pushing the boundaries. And so Monet, Renoir, they were all in that crowd with Manet, and they were really working towards something that was a bit more experimental, using the lessons that they had learned from early photography, that you paint not to a perfect copy, but you paint to an optical copy. What I mean by that is you don't paint an absolute detailed copy, you paint towards people's perceptions, and their perceptions fill in the rest of the details. So you have Monet making experiments like this, where he's painting in these broad color patches, which really works to communicate this incredibly transitory effect of reflections on water. Water is so hard to paint because it's transparent and reflective at the same time, and it's constantly moving. And he never could have gotten there without the lessons learned from early photography. So they were experimenting in so many different ways. They were doing contemporary subject matter. There was also something else that happened that's really huge, and that is there's a greater access to materials. The Industrial Revolution, we don't think about this, but the Industrial Revolution brought about a revolution in paint-making materials. Now, if you want to go paint, you go to Hobby Lobby, Michael's, whatever it is, and there's just row after row of pre-made, pre-packaged, convenient artist supplies that are still kind of expensive, but much more affordable than they used to be. And that makes them far more portable, far more easy to use. And there was a wealth of colors being produced. Purples were very hard to produce, but Mauvine was the first artificial synthetic color to be made. So you now have synthetic colors. Some of these synthetic colors were brighter, more vivid. But one of the greatest innovations was paint made in tubes. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it's true. Before this, if you wanted to paint and take your paint or hold it for a while, you actually had to sew it up in a pig's bladder, which is insane if you can imagine. How gross is that? You have to mix up the paint yourself and sew it up in a pig's bladder. Well, that didn't work terribly well. But then metal tubes came along with screw-on caps, and that meant that you could use a little paint, screw it on, and it was still good. So you didn't have to waste. But the best thing is you could take those paints outside, and you could now paint conveniently. And you can see this revolution happening in Impressionist art, largely because of these innovations in technology. You didn't have to paint in muddy colors. You could paint in bright colors, because you now had these new synthetic paints and pigments that were being created. Cadmium yellows and reds and oranges, lead whites, other things that were really vibrant. Some of these paints were horribly toxic, and some of these paints actually weren't all that color fast. One of the things we look at, Van Gogh loved to use paint straight out of the tube, and unfortunately that meant his paints were going to fade because they weren't exactly formulated for permanence then. This was right at the beginning of formulating new paints. Now we try to formulate paints so that they'll be as permanent as possible. Even then they still fade a bunch. But a lot of Van Gogh paintings look very, very different from what they originally were intended to look like, because he used the colors right out of it. But look at the vibrant colors. Look at the changes that were now possible because of this new revolution in paint. And because they were in tubes, you could take them outside and you could paint from life. You could paint scenes en plein air with sunlight and get this different quality to them. And this was enormous. And, people recognize this. Renoir even said, without color in tubes, there would be no Cezanne, no Monet, no Pissarro, and no Impressionism. And he was absolutely right. So you have people trying to challenge the status quo. You have this huge class battle that's going on. But you also have a group of people who really, really want to be successful, who want to sell and sell to the public at large. And there's not going to be another Salon des Refusés. First of all, you have a complete revolution in the government. You have a kind of collapse of the French government after the Franco-Prussian Wars. You have the Commune of 1870, which we mentioned Courbet was part of. And so you now enter into what's known as the Belle Epoque. A new republic is formed, and you have a remarkable period of stability in France from about 1870, after the collapse of the Commune, all the way up until World War I, to be honest. And it was only recognized in retrospect as the Belle Epoque, as the beautiful era, because you had all this prosperity. And with this prosperity came a whole new market. And a lot of these artists recognized, wait a minute, we don't have to sell to the church or to these wealthy elites or aristocrats, because there's now someone else to sell to, and that's the middle class. And the middle class can dictate tastes, and instead of having tastes dictated to them. You've heard the phrase, if you can't beat them, join them, but the opposite is also true. If you can't join them, you beat them by changing tastes. And you can see this in our society, that we are under the tyranny of taste. We have all these Instagram influencers who say, oh no, you can't do that. You know, drinking out of mason jars, that's so declassed now. I mean, that was rustic and cute once upon a time. There were all these Pinterest recipes for, you know, things served in mason jars. But no, now we've moved on to something else. And so there's this constant churn of people trying to change tastes. And the aristocrats and the elites can no longer dictate tastes. And it's in this environment they say, okay, fine, if we're not going to get another Salon des Refusés, we'll go do it ourselves. And they have, you know, champions in this regard. And you actually see a change in system. Instead of a royal salon organized by the Academy and given once a year, which is where your only access to rich clients, where you're going to see independent salons, independent galleries. And the most important is going to be this guy, Renoir, who was an art dealer. And he poured an enormous amount of money into these Impressionist artists and to these artists at this time. And that changes the world, because you never could have had a success if you hadn't had some investor believe in them. And this changes us from the academic system to the system that, frankly, we're still in today, which is the gallery system. That is, it's not a wealthy academy and a set of elites that are determining tastes. It's galleries. And galleries will sell art. And now, if you wanted to be an artist, if you could put together a portfolio and you could get some blue chip gallery to carry your work, congratulations, you're an artist. Now, when we get to the contemporary period, we'll talk about how the gallery system seems to be collapsing today. That the galleries only let in certain artists and only let certain people buy, and they have become as tyrannical as the Academy was before them. And maybe we'll have some new system in the next 20 years or so. Who knows? I think that the internet is opening things up. But for then, the free market, the gallery system was huge. It was this enormous transformation. You were no longer selling to elites, you were selling to the middle class. The middle class was going to dictate tastes. And so a lot of that dictates why Impressionism looks the way it is. If you look at the great paintings of the more previous movement, realism, they're gigantic. They are epic paintings on the same scale as academic paintings. But if you've ever gone into a gallery and looked at Impressionist paintings, you'll notice they're a lot smaller. They're quadrados. They're these tiny little paintings that could easily hang on a wall. That's because your average client who is going to buy an Impressionist painting isn't going to put it up on... He doesn't have the space to put up a 20-foot painting. That's the kind of thing that only galleries or museums or elites have the space for in their gigantic manners. They're going to be making these things for middle-class sized homes, so the paintings had to be smaller to fit the homes, and the paintings had to be smaller to also fit the budgets. Now these things sell for hundreds of millions of dollars, but at the time they were selling them for much, much lower prices than anyone else. It was a pure market decision. And that also impacts the subject matter, that the subject matter isn't necessarily going to be items of big import. Now, the truth is, a lot of the times, people didn't want that anyway if it was in their home, and they wanted to move to contemporary subjects also. But they were going to move to things that fit people's environment, which explains why they often tend to be smaller, more genre scenes, city scenes, landscapes, those kind of things. So all of this comes together at the first Impressionist Salon of 1874. They form a new society, a cooperative society of anonymous artists, painters, sculptors, and printers. And they have their first independent salon. It's actually held in the old studios of Félix Nadar, who is the famous photographer who established photography. He had a large studio, and the studio had large windows, and it allowed in a lot of natural light. And they set up this exposition, and they did not call themselves Impressionists. That would come later. I'll explain in a bit. And there were a lot of artists who absolutely, jumped in on this. And Duran-Roe was the guy who was funding this. It actually was kind of self-funded. You had to pay a few francs to get in. So you actually had to pay to go to the gallery and see these things. And itself caused an enormous sensation. The term Impressionism actually comes from this painting. So a very famous critic went to go see this, and as near as we can tell, tens of thousands of people went in to go see it. It was really quite sensational at the time. This was a painting that Monet painted in 72, but exhibited in 74 at this gallery exhibition. And its title was Impression Sunrise. And so this is the painting that gives the title to the Impressionists. So the very famous critic, Louis Leroy, came through here, and he wrote up a story about the event. And in typical fashion for the 19th century, he invents a character, a persona, to describe this. This was actually a very common literary technique, that you would invent an alter ego, and then you would have a conversation with this alter ego. The alter ego was just you, and he was your sock puppet, but you would invent this alter ego so that he could give the best quips or one-liners when talking about an art show. And so he invented Monsieur Vincent, who was this, mock patron. And Monsieur Vincent would give these bon mots, these absolute devastating one-liners about this show. And the one about this one is that he said that impression indeed, wallpaper in its most embryonic form is more finished than that seascape. So what he was saying is that, these aren't, that was how they were critiqued, is they weren't finished paintings. They were just impressions of paintings. They were criticized as being rough and sketch-like and really, incomplete. But the Impressionists actually liked the term. That's exactly what they were striving for. They were striving for an optical truth, not an absolute truth. You don't have to give the details. The things that's great about Impressionist painting, you step back from it a couple of feet and the details emerge. What's astonishing to this painting to me is how masterful it is in how little there is actually on the canvas. You have a figure in a boat, you see his reflection in the water, there are cranes and smokestacks and ship masts in the background, but they are just barely suggested. These are all lessons he learned from these high contrast photos of seascapes by Gray. And the sun is just a red dot, and you have these very quick brushstrokes. This is what we call the color patch. The color patch is a key identifier of Impressionism, that the artist, instead of painting in tones and very gradual, kind of gradients, he's going to be painting in quick brushstrokes, little patches. And each one of the Impressionists has a slightly different patch. Renoir's tends to be more wispy, like cirrus clouds. Monet's patches tend to be very kind of solid and meaty. But through this, you create this entire scene. And so this thing was a marvel to the critics. They really didn't know what to do with it. One of the more famous paintings that was included was this, Boulevard des Capuchins by Monet. Although we don't know if it's this one or this one. There's two different variants of this. But either way, when you look at this painting, what I love about this painting is I look at this and immediately I imagine a busy street scene, figures in frock coats and top hats, people going about their business. And then I actually look at the detail and I realize none of that is actually there. The things that I imagine seeing are not there at all. Instead, these are a bunch of greasy smudges with no real definition. And yet it feels like a cityscape. Same for this one. None of these characters are in any detail. The heads are just simple blobs. even the light and the treatment of the buildings. These are the guys sitting here in a balcony that only get any attention at all. And so the message of Impressionism was you could do more with less. You could give this impression. And there were many of the greats that were there. There was Degas. Degas, this was one of the paintings that was included in this show, and you can see the same issue with Degas, that he cares a little bit more about the figures here in the carriage and the horses, but by the time you get to the horses at the distance, and particularly to the trees, it has just faded into wispy brushstrokes. The same with Morisot. Morisot here painting this wonderful scene of the cradle, where she paints just the slightest gesture towards the figure and the lace. Look how quick and fast the brushstrokes are here. Renoir's The Loge was there as well, and Renoir did the same thing but with figures. Renoir loved to show more intimate scenes of figures in kind of urbane environments. But look at her dress and how little there actually is, and yet how much it communicates. Notice how vibrant these things are. Remember realism? Realism still had a pretty dark palette, that muddy brown and gray and reddish palette that existed all the way from the Baroque period was still there. But look at how bright these are. You can especially see it in their landscapes. You look at Sisley, here you can see his color patches, how he works so quickly, how the shadow is probably brighter than even the highlights of some of these earlier realist paintings. Here's a painting that was also mocked by the fictional Monsieur Vincent, and when he saw it, he has this absolute, kind of reaction, and it's interesting that Leroy actually puts himself in the position of kind of being the defender of Impressionism, but he gives all his best one-liners to his fictional counterpart. So when they look at this, Leroy says, "Well, what if this painting?" And the mythical Monsieur Vincent comes back and says, "Well, maybe he was painting this when his spectacles were dirty. He needs to wipe them and clean before he starts painting again," which is just this fabulous diss, because it's so indistinct. Here we have a scene of plowed fields with hoarfrost on them. All the delicate, trees are just blobs, and yet it's really vibrant and communicates a great deal. This was one that Leroy concedes the criticism of his fictional counterpart and says, well, perhaps, it's lacking in some ways, but the impression is there. And Vincent says, well, yes, it's a funny impression. Now, what's interesting is, despite the fact that the critics panned this, it was an amazing kind of moment. It was a great success. It was not particularly a financial success. Several paintings sold, but not to a great degree. But it caused such a stir, it brought in the attention of this middle class, this bourgeoisie seeking to differentiate themselves, just like Instagram influencers today try to be onto the new hot thing before anybody else has jumped onto it. And suddenly they're doing all these reaction videos to whatever the new thing is on the internet. The same thing was true then. People were like, well, this is new, and this is how I can show my sophistication. If the elites aren't going to let me in, I'll go this direction. Cézanne also, participated, and Cézanne created this. Right away, you could tell that Cézanne stuff is a little bit flatter. It has even less kind of a sense of realism than some of the other stuff. So that sparked off the Impressionist movement. There were 8 Impressionist salons between 1874 and 1886. That's not a long period of time. I remember when I first started in art history, I thought, wow, 10 years, that's a long time for a movement. But it's not a long time for a movement now. As you get older and middle-aged, my youngest is 16, and every time I see her, I just want to break out into sunrise, sunset from Fiddler on the Roof. It just makes me want to cry. She's going to be gone in a couple of years. They'll all be off in college. Oh my gosh. And then I'll start being one of those dads who starts complaining about when do I get grandchildren. But not yet. I'm not there yet. Not a grandfather yet. Not ready to be a grandfather yet, but soon. So that's really not a very long period of time, is what I'm saying, before I suddenly went senile and rambled off into my senescence. It's not a long period of time, and that's something that's really interesting, that Impressionism has this enormous impact, but it's a very short-lived movement. And some of the members of the Impressionist movement continue in the style, but most abandon it in quick order. It seems to be the first truly modern movement. There's an intense disagreement amongst art historians about when the first modern movement is. Everybody agrees post-Impressionism is definitely modern. It's really modern. But is Impressionism still modern? Well, we don't know. It's definitely modern in the sense that it moved towards contemporary subject matter. It's definitely modern in the sense that it totally breaks all the conventions of style, puts all this emphasis on the surface of the painting, on emphasizing the mark of the painter, and on them being paintings, not on being images, but being paintings, expressions of the artist's will. And that really is very modern. But on the other hand, I guess I should say, they're actually still attempting to capture nature. In fact, that was one thing that's really interesting, is that there's no Impressionists doing fantasy scenes or deep social commentary. Instead, they seem to be doing things that are entirely just motivated by what they can see. They are committed to this optical truth, this optical veracity above all. And that's what really kind of links them in some way to the past, that they seem to be caught in this mode of representing reality still. They're making landscapes, and they're making them in a totally new way that emphasizes the mark of the painter, but they want to capture reality. You know, they're impressions, but they're still impressions of reality. They're painting them from real life. They're going out with their easels or into the cabarets or into these social venues or streets and capturing these scenes. And that's what their intent is. There's still this commitment to naturalism. Even though it's a very different kind of naturalism than came before, there's still a commitment to naturalism. And that probably is what separates them from being the first true modern movement. All right, well, enough clearing of throats. Let's get into some of these characters. So probably the one that's regarded as one of the big founders of the Impressionist movement is going to be Claude Monet. Claude Monet is interesting because he's one of the ones that, pioneers this concept of the color patch and was so committed to optical veracity. Cézanne said of Monet, "Monet is only an eye," which sounds like a burn. It sounds like that the only thing that can do is capture what he sees. But we have to get the second part of that quote. Cézanne says Monet is only an eye, but my God, what an eye. And that's absolutely probably the best thing I've ever heard said about Monet, is that Monet really had this ability to capture optical veracity at a level that none of the other Impressionists had. When you see him, think about a bush. How do you paint a bush, How do you paint something where the leaves are in motion, where there's so much of them, where you can't even count every individual leaf? You'd hardly even try now. And the Impressionists were like, you don't have to capture that. You only have to capture the impressionist of it. So when you see things like hollyhocks, or when you see things like, in this case, his wife, when his son, out in the sunlight, in a field where the field is moved by light and moved by sun and shadow and wind. That sense of motion, that sense of spontaneity that is so hard to capture, he managed to capture. He was so committed to capturing the spontaneous quality of light that he would often do multiple studies simultaneously. So he would go out and paint haystacks, but he would paint the same 2 haystacks over and over again. And what he would do is he would set up his easels, and, he would have 3 or 4 easels lined up. And he would paint go out, paint in the early morning, and he would work for 20 minutes or so on one painting. But after 20 minutes or so, the light has really changed. The shadows have all moved. And so he's like, okay, I can't paint on that anymore. I got to come back and paint on it tomorrow. And so he would move to the next easel. And so you get these series of iterations of light. He almost has a record of the movement of light. So here are haystacks in the early morning, and here are haystacks in the afternoon. Same two haystacks, slightly different perspectives, different light series. My favorite are the series of Rouen Cathedral. He would paint Rouen Cathedral. He would paint it early in the morning, and then also at high noon. This field here, he painted both of these, and it's the exact same field, just the difference between morning and midday. And you can see how careful he's looking at it, that, you know, here the light is behind this tree in the foreground, and now it's moved to on top of the tree, and the highlights have changed, and the quality of light has changed. But look, there's nothing there that's painted. I mean, he could paint this whole thing with, you know, a fat brush. He hardly ever noodled in any details. Same thing when he was working in London. He would paint the Houses of Parliament in various different states of weather, or day, or night, over and over again, never varying from this commitment to try and capture the quality of the light that he was seeing. Monet, it's interesting that he's one of the few who never varied his style. His style pretty much got locked in by the 1870s. He felt like he had achieved what he had attempted to achieve, to capture this absolute quality of light, this optical veracity, not this pure veracity, but an optical veracity, this thing where you step 6 paces back from the painting and it feels vibrant like a photograph or something in life. And he continued that right up until his last days. He never varied and never changed. As the rest of the world went on into post-impressionism, into modernism, well into the 20th century, he was painting in this same way and is known for this kind of style. Of course, he retired to his place at Giverny and then would paint the pond there. Here you have the water lilies and an endless series of these that he painted. One of my favorite examples of this absolute commitment to optical veracity happens when he paints the Japanese bridge. The property had a Japanese bridge over the lily pond, and it was one of his favorite subjects. And here you can see him painting in 1899 and sticking very much to this impressionistic technique. But as he got older, he began to suffer macular degeneration. His eyesight was failing him. He could still see, but things weren't nearly as distinct as before. And so he's still painting this bridge, but he's painting this bridge in according to what he can see. And it's still there. It's still the same technique. It's his eyesight that's failing him. He's trying to capture the sensation of what he's seeing and how committed he is to it. Renoir was also one of these early Impressionists who only exhibited in the first few Impressionist salons and ultimately abandoned the style, got away from it because he felt that he had explored it to the full extent. He's more interested, again, in... And we sometimes have this misinterpretation of Impressionists. We often think of them associated with landscapes. Pissarro and Monet did a lot of landscapes. But Pissarro and Monet also did things like steam engines, factories, city scenes. They did all kinds of things. They were not so much interested in capturing landscape or pastoral imagery. We sometimes think of it being, Impressionism as being overly pastoral, and that's not the case. What they were trying to capture was reality. What they were trying to capture was the contemporary world around them in all of its forms. Renoir is a little different in that Renoir, almost all of his scenes, him and Degas, show people and emphasize not the landscape or the whole scene, but the figures in the scene. And like many others, he was attracted to whatever was happening, whatever was lively, whatever form of entertainment was popular at the time. So here we have the Bal du Moulin de la Galette, and in this case what we have is a scene, again, another one of these outdoor entertainment venues, People are dancing, people are drinking, people are enjoying a good time, and they're doing so under a canopy of trees. When you do this, the sunlight is going to filter through, and this is one of the most infuriating things to try to capture in a painting, because, again, the sun doesn't stand still, the leaves don't stand still, they're constantly in motion. If you've ever seen a photograph of all the dappled shadows and light that come through a canopy of leaves, you just imagine painting that, how frustrating that would be. But Impressionism gives us a way to tackle that perhaps we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And so what you see is that he treats it as if the light is just blurry pieces of motion. He gives us a sense of the motion and the sense of time. These kind of ideas and treatments of light and color actually move painting into the fourth dimension. And I just recently discovered that the term fourth dimension, that is, using time as a fourth dimension, actually occurred in the arts before it was actually mentioned in physics. I didn't realize that until recently, that it was artists who used this concept of the fourth dimension first. That you give this sense of movement, of light, and of shadow. And it's something that Impressionism can do to so much a greater degree than anything else. So we see him doing this in many of his portrait series. His color patch is going to be far softer. It's very wispy. It's very light and delicate. Tends to flatten these figures out some, but really just every part of the painting then is dynamic and alive. Whether you can see it in this boating party or the other figures, it gives it energy. He always kind of concentrates on these kind of social gatherings of various different figures, mixed figures, figures from, the kind of bourgeoisie and bohemian lifestyle that he enjoyed. But by the time he gets into the late 1870s, 1880s, he really begins to feel that Impressionism has run aground, that it was an explosion of interest in the technique, but the technique really begins to lose its potency. And he actually changes subject matter entirely, and he goes back to, of all things, the classical nude. So after having abandoned kind of classical subject matter and gone to contemporary subject matter, he now finds himself going back to the classical subject matter. And that actually makes sense if you think about it. The question that everybody begins to ask themselves is, what is painting about? Is painting about capturing an image? If it's about capturing an image, then the subject matter matters. It's, it's the narrative, it's the story, it's whatever it is. But if a painting is about the painting, then the subject matter doesn't matter. It's about the treatment of the paint on the surface. And so going back to an arbitrary subject matter like the classical nude is actually a decent choice. It's just an arbitrary kind of capricious decision to go back to a classical nude, because then it highlights the surface and the quality of the paint. And you can see that especially here in this figure, where we have the dappled sunlight on the nude, and when you get to the background just descends into chaos. Beautiful, beautiful chaos, representing, foliage and other things behind the figure, and you can see how it blends in almost entirely with the drapery. Eventually he would go back to an almost kind of classical understanding of the nude. You can see that in his later paintings, he gets much tighter in his brushwork on things like drapery and the human figure. Compare it to this figure where, there's almost no distinction between the brushwork of the figure and the background. Here you have this very, very strong clarifying difference between the nudes, which are fairly tight and detailed, and the background, which is more impressionistic. I think this one is my favorite example of this, where we have just enough of the figure is rendered in a tight format that it reads better, but the background here, this kind of landscape that she's seated in with waterfalls and vegetation, is just a kind of impressionist fantasy. And it shows that these things really are experiments, that we are going beyond the subject matter, that we're truly exploring the material. Also, I want you to know he wasn't a time traveler. He did paint that in the year 18,887. That's a typo. I can't believe I did that. That's horribly embarrassing. Moving on. Pissarro. Pissarro is sometimes called the father of Impressionism, and he's one of the few that actually painted in all and exhibited in all 8 Impressionist salons. Most of the Impressionist painters who were there in the first salon weren't there by the end. This was a fractious group. They had lots of disagreements. They often had conflicting personalities, and so the group didn't have any greater cohesion than the fact that they were these young artists that wanted to change the world and were trying to change it with this style. But not very long into it, they run into conflicts, and so they break away. So Monet, Pissarro are some of the few that actually hung with it through that time. And Pissarro, much like Monet, continued to paint, and he continued to paint in Impressionist style, but you can see him changing by the time we reach the 1880s, that he is influenced by some of the experiments going on in the post-Impressionist period. When we look at his works, you can see that same color patch. What I like about Pissarro's color patches is they seem more solid, blocky, substantial, instead of being a kind of oblate kind of patch like Monet or a wispy cloud-like patch like Renoir. They feel very solid. They give a kind of dimension to it. Still, he was famous for producing these kind of compositions that have multiple overlapping elements, trees, obscuring villages, etc. One of my favorite examples is a later piece where he has this kind of tipped-up view, giving us this view of a street scene. Again, we often associate the Impressionists with the pastoral, with landscapes and scenes of fields and haystacks. They were just as interested in cities and factories and everything else. We'll talk a little bit more about Pissarro and some of his later work, but we're going to hold that off when we get to the last Impressionist exhibition. Next, we're going to talk about Degas. Degas was active in all but one of the Impressionist salons, and he's also, again, another one of these bourgeoisie, bohemian characters that doesn't have to paint, and he mostly retires by the year 1886. And by retire, I mean he stops painting. He continues to do a few pastels after that, but his artistic production almost completely comes to an end in 1886. And he lives for a very long time. He lives long enough to see the Fauvists and the Cubists, and actually, according to tradition, makes a trip to go see the studios of Picasso, when Picasso experimenting with Cubism. So he continued to be a person in the art world, but he himself just ceased to produce. He had reached the end of whatever he wanted to achieve and quit doing it. He too was also interested in kind of interior scenes. One of the most famous examples is the absinthe, the glass of absinthe. Again, we talked about how absinthe was a drink of the bohemian classes and also the lower classes. It's this clear licorice, anise-flavored liquor that was also flavored with wormwood that was supposed to cause hallucinations. Had a horrible reputation as a drink and was eventually banned. But when you put sugar and water in it, it turned this kind of milky white or green color. But what I love about this scene is the figures seem completely disinterested. These are obviously not higher class individuals. They are there with the drink. There's a sense of the space around them, and by that I mean the emotional space, that they are lonely, isolated figures. Of course, if you are a fan of Degas, you have to know about his fascination with ballerinas. Again, I think his fascination with ballerinas was this idea of these very kind of extreme figures and poses in these interior environments. He would often attend ballet. He often had arrangements to watch things backstage so that he could get these kind of candid moments. In his earlier paintings, you can start to see how he is treating the tutus and the dresses and the backgrounds, the reflections. He loves the reflections of mirrors and the odd lighting that exists. But it's when he gets to his stage scenes that you really can see how he begins to pull this off. Stages, we now live in the world of stages where you have these huge lighting systems hung from all kinds of, systems that are above. Oh my gosh. I have a brother who's a theater director, and he would just absolutely slap me silly if I couldn't remember what these things are called. I don't know, but, you know, we have lights on trolleys and other things that are above the stage, so you can actually light these things any way you want. But at this time, lighting is either by gaslight or by arc light, and the lighting is almost always along the front of the stage. So the front of the stage and the lighting is right here. And so if you've ever wondered, why do Degas' ballerinas have this bizarre, almost like horror lighting, where there's this underlight that shines up and gives them this ghastly appearance? That's why, because he was true to the light source. He was true to these gas and arc lamps that would cast this bright light, and it would shine upwards. So here you can see the underside of the arms illuminated and the upper sides in shadows. Here you can see this woman's face, the upper parts in shadows. This also throws ghastly kind of lights onto the scenery. The scenery is reduced to just almost mere scribbles, and he concentrates on the motion and the action of the figures. Probably the best one is this one, The Star, where you have this elaborate illumination from underneath. Her leg just blends into her tutu. Her tutu is just this fury of quick brushstrokes, and then you have that very sharp, bizarre underlighting, and then all of the scenery here and the figures hiding between the scenery or under the scenery are almost lost in the background. So this wonderful blurring of light. Degas was also a kind of a sculptor, and sculpted quite a few pieces, and was responsible for bringing a lot of experimental materials and methods as well. This is one of his more famous, and I know this sounds bizarre, but when this was first created, he made it in wax, and he actually used a dress to dress it. This is the beginning of the introduction of non-traditional materials, where you're breaking boundaries. You know, if you're going to sculpt something, you sculpt it out of something permanent in bronze. Now it is cast in bronze, but at the time he was using wax and actual dresses to kind of communicate the reality of it. So as far as sculpture goes, he was just as experimental. And when you look at the hair and the treatment of the hair and the details of the neck and the arm, you can see that he hasn't smoothed this out to a consistency. He has left this texture of his fingerprints in it. He has brought a kind of impressionist sensibility to the surface. As I mentioned before, that by the time we get to the end of his life, he really isn't painting anymore. There's very few paintings and works of art past 1886. Most of them are pastels. But his pastels are famous for bringing that same kind of sensibility, that treatment of light. One of the things that people don't recognize is he had two subjects that he absolutely was in love with. One were ballet dancers, which is very popular, but he also loved jockeys. He would go out and watch the races, and he would paint jockeys. And I think there's a kind of strange alignment between these two figures, because they're both small. Jockeys had to be lightweight. These dancers were incredibly young. Sometimes they were 12, 14 years old. And they're also very small, very delicate, but they also are extreme athletes. That is, that, you know, you have jockeys who are riding these horses at incredible speeds and had to be incredible athletes, and the ballet dancers, these ballerinas and prima donnas, had to be incredible athletes in order to perform their dancing. So there's something about the extreme of performance that's linked in these figures. He painted just as many paintings about horses and jockeys as he did ballerinas. There was a fabulous show, oh gosh, more than 20 years ago now, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art that focused on this aspect of his painting, which brought a lot of it. You know, people tend to gravitate to the more kind of sentimental or resonating images. That's why he's known for his ballerinas, and it's why, you know, Monet is known for his haystacks, even though he was just as likely to paint bridges and steam engines. And the same thing with Degas. They gravitate to his ballerinas, but his jockeys deserve attention. Love these brushstrokes, these very, you know, decisive moments, these highlights of extreme color. And of course, that's the best way to capture these silks and satins, because they have these bright, luminescent reflections. Really incredible. There is one American that's right in this circle at the same time that this is happening, that exhibited also in the same circle with Degas and others, and that is Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt basically told her parents she was going to go, and she came and became such a success that she eventually moved her whole family with her over to Paris. So while we claim her as an American, she was definitely part of this early movement. Her artwork, too, again, reduces figures in the background to mere kind of blobs, kind of faceless suggestions, but that's more than enough to give you the sense of the figure and the suggestion moving and the figure moving forward. What I love about her work is that her work also brings a feminist sensibility. What I love about this one is this is in the loge. This is a woman attending the theater. She is looking with her glasses here to the performance, but a clever viewer will recognize that this male figure here is using his glasses to check her out. So there's this subtle recognition of the male gaze and the kind of unwanted male gaze. It's something that I think only a female artist would pick up. One of the things that she's famous for is for these wonderful depictions of her sister Lydia. Lydia was a beauty, and she would go to all these social functions, so she often made many portraits of her. So here you can see Lydia reflected in a mirror. The Impressionists loved mirrors and the kind of wonderful, kind of blurry qualities that they give. But look at the quality of light and the treatment of flesh, something that I think is even more powerful in her depictions of her sister when she's using pastels. So here we see the pastels, and just masterful. Again, doing so much with so little. One of the things I think we get wrong about Mary Cassatt is that we often associate her with images of women and children. She herself did not have children. And lots has been written about this, almost a kind of psychoanalytical approach. But I think that it almost misses the mark. This was one of her earlier paintings. You can tell by the darker palette. Here's one of her later paintings. But she often depicted scenes of mothers and children because this was the reality of her social circle. She was with other women. Women had their children, etc. And in many ways, we misunderstand Mary Cassatt because we assume that because she was a woman, she had this greater interest in women and children, when in reality all the Impressionists were painting things that were around them. They were painting the things of their life. They were this commitment to this optical veracity of the things they saw. So that was her social circle, so that's what she painted. Still, there's a lot of feminist and psychoanalytical treatments of this. One thing I do want to stress is she was also a printmaker. Many of these artists were also printmakers, and she revealed a lot of the influence of Japanese prints. Japanese prints were also very, very prominent at this time. Japan had recently opened its markets. Japanese prints were coming into European and American territories, and as we saw with Whistler and others, they were captivated by the graphic flatness of these prints, and that they had such beautiful qualities. And when you look at some of her paintings or prints, you can see these same qualities. This wonderful woman bathing herself. Women bathing was a theme of Japanese prints. It was a very common theme out of the Edo period. And also there's a kind of isometric perspective here, which is indicative. Notice how little depth there is. The figures are mostly outlined. They're flat. Again, a kind of isometric perspective. These are all characteristics of Japanese art that was assimilated into Impressionism and into post-Impressionism. Which brings us back to Manet. Manet started out as a realist, and he was the kind of flaneur who gathered all of these groupies around him that got this whole thing started. But he himself began to experiment, moving into much brighter color palettes. So again, when you compare Manet's works from earlier to this period, you can see how much brighter the colors are, how much more vivid the scenes are. And likewise, Manet was painting scenes that were, again, contemporary scenes, scenes of contemporary life. The feeling was, we are living in the contemporary world. Why do we need to paint all these old dead Roman and Greek gods? Let's paint the stuff of our era. It has more import to us than the past anyway. And you can really see that in some of his, later works. This one was really just one of his more famous works from his Impressionist period. I like this one because it actually is of the same kind of sense as his earlier works in the 1860s. That is, his earlier works had a very strong social component and a component of social commentary, and this one does as well. So if you remember Olympia or Luncheon on the Grass, you remember that you had these nude women in contemporary contexts that couldn't be confused for anything other than contemporary women, and they were deliberately mocking the Academy and its conventions for taking contemporary women and pretending that they were Venuses or something else. And I think this is a kind of epilogue to that same kind of imagery. Let me walk you through what we're seeing here. First of all, what we are seeing is a barmaid. This woman here is at a bar, and this isn't somebody behind the bar, this is her reflection. Now, before anybody says reflections don't work like that, remember, these guys don't care. Particularly Manet doesn't care. Manet doesn't care about reflections. I mean, this violates the law of physics. The reflection should actually be right behind her, about that there. So showing it there is his way of messing with physics because he has a greater story to tell. So let's walk through some of the details. She, by her dress, is obviously someone who is of a lower economic station, shall we say. She is dressed and put on display, and she is there serving all kinds of things to the people who are in attendance at the Folies Bergère. She has oranges to sell, she has various liquors and drinks, champagne. This is Red Triangle beer, which is still around. I'm not a drinker, so I didn't recognize this, but, there's been a lot written about the variety of products. These are all historically accurate to this time. So she is there to serve goods to the people who are there being entertained, and the mirror shows people in the balcony with their opera glasses watching the entertainment, and the entertainment in this case is a trapeze artist. You can see the trapeze artist's feet dangling in there. But what's perhaps the most interesting is that she looks at us with a look of kind of almost resignation, I would say. Not necessarily sadness, but just acceptance of the situation. And because we can see the mirror, we can see who she's looking at. She is looking at a very dapper individual. He's painted very cursorily in a quick fashion. He has a kind of wonderful Van Dyke beard, wearing a top hat. And we get a sense of what's going on. Remember, we're looking at a mirror. So this figure here is the person speaking to this person here, and that person is us, the viewer. And so there's again a kind of message going on here, and the message is, I think, subtle. Some of the clues are this wonderful bracelet, the choker. Remember Olympia? Remember that she had a choker and a bracelet. These were signs of prostitutes at the time. And although I don't think this woman is necessarily a prostitute, the implication is that she is of a lower social class and that she is part of the commodities on sale, that she is selling all of these things, but she herself is presented as a commodity. And obviously that's what this guy is doing here. He's making the moves on her, and yet from her expression we are left to wonder, what is this? This is clearly not an entirely positive image of her situation. It's a wonderful commentary, social commentary, I think, about the nature of this lifestyle. I think this is, if Manet is to be credited for anything as a painter, I actually think there's better painters from both the realist and the impressionist period, but there's seldom better thinkers. That the way he puts his subjects together creates these multiple layers that you could never find in a Monet or a Pissarro. And I think it's this social depth and context that really makes him stand out as an exemplary painter. So many different ways to read it. Well, let's talk about the legacy and impact of Impressionism. By the time we got to the 8th Impressionist exposition, quite frankly, Impressionism was in a state of crisis, and it was really falling apart. Over 179 artists exhibited in the first Impressionist Salon in 1874. By the 4th, there were only 15. Most people had gone on. Most of the expositions, in financial terms, were unsuccessful. They really didn't sell a lot of money, and poor Durand-Ruel, who quite frankly threw a lot of money into this, lost his shirt in this. By the 6th exposition, Degas was trying to organize something. He actually got a hotel and put on an auction, and the auction didn't even cover the costs of the exposition, and so that put them into financial debt. So the whole thing came to blows. Degas and Cassatt were arguing, and it split it up. The 7th one, Durand-Ruel organized it himself because the painters couldn't be trusted to organize it themselves. And you could actually see the collapse of the expositions in the graphic design. Just to refresh your memory, let us go back. So this was the actual catalog for the first exposition. Beautiful piece of typography. Very classic, very simple. The kind of thing that, even today no one would sneeze at. Very well done. Okay? This was the catalog for the 7th one. It's literally handwritten. Literally written, so, and of course this is before people were into kind of rustic, cute things like this, but yeah. It shows that the whole thing had kind of really got apart. This looks like some of my students' work when they're desperate and turning it in at the last moment. So you can see that the expositions had kind of failed. Friendships were broken. Finances were a disaster. The organization of the thing had really kind of collapsed. And the person who had kind of been the unifying figure around so much of it, that is Manet, died. He died early. And by 1884, in order to recoup his losses for having invested in this group of bohemian flaneurs, Durand-Ruel is selling off Manet's studio at bottom basement prices just to recoup his losses and to stave off bankruptcy. And so, but despite, it's funny because Impressionism kind of was a failure. It didn't last terribly long, and it wasn't a great financial success for any of the people involved. But it changed the rules forever about what painting is and what painting should be, which is why so many people regard it as the first modern movement. One of the things that it did is it forever broke the hierarchy of painting. In painting, there's this hierarchy where, great classical works, history painting, that's what painting was supposed to be about. But you have Cassatt doing paintings of street scenes and even floor scrapers. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but this painting was an absolute scandal when it was created, because he has these shirtless working class men were obviously working class men, because here they are scraping a floor in preparation of final finishing. And this was considered low, but it was also considered scandalous to show, working class men working, and to kind of elevate something like this to the status of painting it was just kind of absurd. So never again would painters really be constrained by the hierarchy of painting. Painters after this paint what they want. They paint what they're interested in, and if it's contemporary life or social realism, they're going to jump right on it. And so that is gone. So the hierarchy of painting is gone. Genre and landscape no longer have to be justified by putting in something like, you know, a scene from the Bible in it. No, those were perfectly acceptable subject matters, and anybody could paint them. And painting was what was driven by the painter. It wasn't driven by the elites. If the painter could sell it, that's what sold, and that's what mattered. The other thing that really changed was technique, is that it forever shattered this dependence on one kind of technique or on a reliance on absolute naturalism. If you think back to the academic styles of Ingres and these beautifully glassy smooth glazes, these smooth, flawless gradients, no one was ever going to paint like that ever again, unless they wanted to and they had a reason to. I mean, we've had photorealists even today, but no one felt compelled to do that. And in fact, even by the end of the 19th century, academic painters who were well regarded by the Academy and by elites, started copying Impressionistic techniques. Two of my favorites, which we'll talk about in a little bit, are going to be John Singer Sargent and the American painter who was active in England and Paris, and Anders Zorn, who was a Swedish painter. Both of these painters decided to fully embrace the alla prima, the all-at-once techniques, the plein air techniques, and the loose impressionistic brushstrokes of the Impressionist movement. You're going to see, I mean, I love looking at Zorn paintings and Sargent paintings because, again, you back away, and the figure of this female face, or this self-portrait by Zorn, they feel like they're completely there. I mean, you know, you step back 4 or 5 feet, and they read like photographs in a way, but you get close and you're like, holy crap, that's just a big sloppy brushstroke. Sargent is famous for this. When you look at Sargent's hands, there's almost nothing there. When you look at the hair, there's so little there. There is a Sargent in the BYU Museum of Art, and I absolutely fall in love with it. It's an elderly woman, and you stand back from it, and it just resonates. Realism, and you get close, and there's this big purple brushstroke in the shadow, and it's gotta be like 10% of her face. It's maybe 1 or 2 brushstrokes at the most. And you know, if you look at a Sargent or a Zorn close up, they look like a drop cloth. They look so sloppy and so messy. Same thing with Whistler. There's this painting of a Whistler in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's one of my all-time favorite paintings, and it's this woman against a black background, and she has this boot, this cream-colored leather boot, and stand 10 feet away from it, and that boot, you think that the whole thing is there, and it's just so beautiful, and you get close, and you realize he has painted the barest suggestion of the outline of the boot, and all of that boot is just communicated by the highlight that he painted. And your brain has done the rest. Well, so many artists, particularly even artists that were well regarded by the Academy, like Sargent and Zorn, realize this is the way you got to paint. Not only does it have more vitality, it saves you time, and there's no sense in painting the other way. And so Impressionism changes the Academy. That's the way that you can tell that you've really won an argument, when even people who are in the Academy start painting like this, when they start using minimal detail. But the other thing that it did is it totally upended the idea of what a painting should be. Again, this goes back to Clement Greenberg. Clement Greenberg was this critic from the 20th century who was this huge champion of the abstract expressionists. And is a painting about, you know, this mythical, magical window that transports you to another destination? Or is a painting just paint on canvas? Is it about the surface? And when you look at a work like the Gare at Saint-Lazare by Monet, you realize it fundamentally is about the surface. Yes, you can see the steam and the engines and the locomotives and the glass and the canopy and all of that. He communicates that very well. He even communicates the buildings disappearing into the mist. But what's most compelling about it is the surface quality of it. You know, ignore what you're looking at. It's a beautiful painting just in terms of brushstrokes and color and light. You can especially see this in the works of Sisley, that, you know, it really doesn't matter what the heck this painting is about. It doesn't matter that it's a landscape. What it is paint on canvas, and it's gorgeous. And people recognized that at the time. Gotta go back to my bro, Daumier. I use Daumier so much because his cartoons are so dead on. They cut right to the quick and tell you exactly what's going on. So he critiqued, so Daumier lived long enough to critique the Academy. He lived long enough to critique the realists. I love that cartoon where he says, "Don't be so bourgeois. Just at least try to look at this Courbet." And he even went on and critiqued. The Impressionists, and I love this one. And the caption in here reads, you know, the first copies nature, and the second copies the first. And that is so true. You can actually see it unfold in the works of Cézanne. So, Guillaumin was one of these Impressionist painters that exhibited at many of the Impressionist salons, and he was painting nature. And you can see that Cézanne looks at his painting and realizes, you know what? It's not the scene that matters. It's the way the paint goes down. And he exaggerates the quality of the paint, pushing it further and further until it's just shapes on a canvas. And this is what brings us to post-impressionism or neo-impressionism. That the last Impressionist salon is actually dominated by a whole new group of artists who are not painting in the Impressionist style, who have gone on to new and experimental divisionist techniques, like Seurat. And you can even see this in the works of Pissarro's. Pissarro's later works get flatter. Notice that his color patch is not so solid and blocky and substantial. It's insubstantial. It's become even smaller than Monet's color patch. It's these light little things. And this is a divisionist technique. You can see Seurat's works is entirely done up with what we call pointillism, painted in tiny little dots. And so you see that technique has become entirely freed from the need to actually represent reality. So while Monet is definitely trying to represent reality, his brushwork shows people that's not what painting is about. A painting is not about reality. We can make it about whatever we want. And as you get to the last Impressionist salon, it's very clear this painting has a fakeness about it, an artificiality that the Impressionist paintings don't. The Impressionist paintings are still trying to capture nature, but it's obvious that Pissarro and Seurat at this point are not trying to capture nature. They're trying to create a vision. They're trying to create a painting. They may have looked at nature as their springboard, but that's just the springboard. It no longer determines what the final result is. And optical veracity, the kind of defining characteristic of Impressionism, is done. We are going to be striving for an internal truth. We're not going to be trying to capture an external reality through a new and vibrant technique. The technique has been completely liberated from trying to describe any external realities. Now we're going to try and show the internal realities, and if the paintings become more fake, all the better. If they become more abstract or more obviously constructions instead of, you know, reactions to reality, they're just constructions out of the artist's imagination, all the better, because then they become more expressive. And this is the moment in the late 1880s that we cross over into a movement that we still don't know how to categorize, because the only way we can categorize it is by calling it post-impressionism. It's the thing that was birthed by Impressionism, but it has so many different styles and so many different views, we can't even come up with a coherent concrete term for it. The only thing we can say is it's the stuff that came after post-impressionism, and that's the stuff that everybody recognizes is finally definitively modern, where it's all about the surface of the paint, it's all about the painting, reality doesn't matter, and it's about the expression of the artist. Perfect. We'll stop there. We'll start next time with post-impressionism. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.